I would like to start by tendering my sincere apologies to the Chamber and to all in the courtroom for my late appearance owing to circumstances beyond my control. I am just coming back from Timbuktu, and I am happy to be here with you. My submission will focus mostly on two items. First, a number of remarks, more or less relevant, pertaining to this matter, while the second throng will deal with the response of the victims relating to the guilt and to the request for pardon as expressed during the previous hearings. Mr. President, Your Honors, I am the legal representative of the victims of Timbuktu, who have in their totality had to bear a shameful experience. Shame that was brought upon them by Mr. Mahdi and the members of Ansar Din in the course of the events of 2012. An indescribably shameful experience that has befallen these people who have seen their ancestors uncovered and exposed using pickaxes, hoes, and bladed weapons. The shame of seeing their saints uncovered, demystified, and diminished without any form of explanation whatsoever. Where there is shame, the desire to hide simply overwhelms a simple desire to veil over one's blemishes. Yet, the victims of Timbuktu have refused to go into hiding or to hide. Through us and by our voice, they appear before your chamber to express their views on their shame and suffering, but also on their hopes and confidence. Mr. President, Your Honors, I am the spokesperson for the victims of Timbuktu. I am the voice of the monuments and mausoleums tolling here on behalf of these victims, tolling here that you may hear their cause and also the cause of the entire international community. This voice brings echoes to those listening of the hatred and the anger and violence that has been experienced. And it also carries the cries of their pain. That is what the victims of Timbuktu want to shout out so that they may be heard and understood. Mr. President, for the very first time, the first time in its history, your court has the opportunity to try a man, Mr. Al-Mahdi, for the destruction of a world cultural heritage. It is indeed a singular opportunity to address what we see as the constant destruction of historical and religious monuments, which again must be said is ongoing even to this day across the world. Mr. President, when I took up this case, the victims were not participants in the proceedings. Today, however, they appear before you in this matter because all of them, albeit in different ways, have experienced irreparable shame and suffering. Your Honors, in order to understand these things, I raised 3 questions to myself at the very site of the crime during my interviews with victims in Timbuktu. The questions are as follows. What is the relation between the victims and the mausoleums? How did the victims feel at the time of the destruction of the mausoleums in 2012? And what is the impact of the destruction 4 years later? Without consulting each other, it must be said that all persons I interviewed had the same answer. All of them mentioned their suffering and their expectation that justice delivered would be commensurate to the crimes committed. All the victims whom I met expressed their shame and the intellectual disconnect that occurred after the destructions. When I questioned victim A35006/16, I quote, "I was overwhelmed. I had vertigo. I was powerless. I was unable to act." All the victims whom I represent before you clearly expressed their shame and the fact that there was an intellectual disruption, as I mentioned a short while ago. Mr. President, the victims appear before your court because they are able to prove that damage has been done in a direct nexus to the alleged crime. In the case at hand, it is the shame and the suffering that have been experienced by the victims arising from the destruction, which amounts to moral prejudice directly linked to the crime committed by Mr. Al-Mahdi and the members of Ansar Din. Further to this moral prejudice, there is also financial damage. When I interviewed the victims, A35004/16, for example, shame again was mentioned. Financial loss again was mentioned. Therefore, there is moral prejudice and financial prejudice. Many victims earned a living from tourism and pilgrimage activities in their area. Following the crisis in Mali, tourists have abandoned the area and the incomes of victims have significantly been reduced. In any event, the prejudice suffered by the victims is shameful and has been brought to bear not only on the physical persons whom I represent, but also on the mausoleums as legal entities. Mr. President, Your Honors, there is a direct link between the crime committed by Mr. Mahdi and the members of his group on the one hand, and the prejudice suffered by the victims on the other hand. The shame that the victims have experienced by seeing their saints stripped naked, and the shame experienced by their powerlessness. The helplessness that arose because they could not do anything. You see, Mr. President, it is not possible to defend spirits. Rather, the spirits protect and defend living people, and they cannot ask living human beings to protect them. In Timbuktu, those alive stood helplessly as their saints were being attacked. And that is the source of the shame that the victims feel. Shame in relation to their saints for some, and shame in relation to their ancestors for others. Mr. President, all those whom I represent today before you have very close links with their ancestors and their saints. These ancestors and saints were previously covered by their tombs, which today have been demystified. The dead are already dead, but Mr. Mahdi and his group took it out on their tombs with a view to terrorizing the living. The accused and his group acted as a common entity with the intent to destroy monuments and the specific symbols that are the substrate of the identity and culture of a nation, namely Mali. Their intent was to assert a different identity, which at this historic moment does not in any way correspond to the values protected in the Convention of the Hague. Mr. President, Your Honors, I have been given the opportunity to see and to understand these things before this hearing, and I'm referring here to the scope of the prejudice and damage suffered by the victims. In Mali, people believe in a single creator who breathed life into all things, living or not. Ancestral worship is also important. Beliefs in magic are commonplace. Islam, which initially was a religion for the elite, is widespread in Mali without, however, having annihilated, so to speak, the animistic beliefs of the people. In Timbuktu, most of the inhabitants practice very strict Islam, yet they still cohabit with animistic or mixed belief systems. These belief systems have a profound influence on the organization of society, which today is still being led by elders. Once again, Islam and the Sharia have only been superimposed on these ancient customs. Family duties, clan responsibilities pertaining to crimes, conflict settlement through financial compensation are also matters that remain governed by a number of practices. And in spite of the Islamization of the people, the matrilineal lines continue to obtain, and succession has continued to be collateral. Mr. President, Timbuktu has had a prestigious past, but its troubled modern history has led to the subsistence only of a few architectural vestiges. However, the religious monuments remain an essential reference in today's town. The El Henna, Khalidi, Alduguri, Jagere mosques may have been destroyed a long time ago. 3 essential mosques, the Jingare Bear Mosque, the Sankore Mosque, and the Sidi Yahya Mosque, fortunately still stand today as testimony of the greatness of Timbuktu. Furthermore, in addition to the mosques, the 16 cemeteries and the mausoleums of the saints continue to stand as essential elements of the local monuments in the area. Rather than appear as piles of stones, these religious monuments are vestiges of ancient centuries and bear significant religious and affective value to the people of Timbuktu, and are indeed a rampart that provides protection for the city. Founded between the 11th and 12th centuries by Tuareg tribes, Timbuktu has been listed in the World Heritage since 1988 and has become an important as well as ancient center of Islam and trade. The city of 333 saints was at its highest in the 15th century as a pearl of the desert that it was at the time. Timbuktu was a major center for Islamic teaching, and through its mausoleums and mosques has continued to conserve rare treasures. This is the historical and cultural heritage that was destroyed by Mr. Mahdi and his Ansardine accomplices. In the city of 333 saints, the group did not only attack simple or ordinary tombs, but targeted precious vestiges of African and world history. Such destruction is indeed tragic, not only for the country, but for all of Africa and for all of humanity. This destruction is an annihilation of the efforts that were undertaken since 1993 by the Malian Ministry in charge of culture. It is in 1993 that this ministry created the Cultural Mission of Timbuktu, a small structure whose basic role was to conserve and to promote the various sites in collaboration with various community groups. Furthermore, Mr. President, Your Honors, there has always been within the international community a great concern for the protection of Timbuktu and its mausoleums. At the beginning of the crisis in Mali, the Director General of UNESCO, Madame Irina Bokova, called out to all parties on no less than 10 occasions. She called out to the parties in the conflict to respect and protect the sites, as well as called on the international community to be mobilized for the protection of the Malian cultural heritage. Similarly, on behalf of the entire international community, UNESCO sent or addressed letters to the leaders of countries neighboring Mali, to the African Union, to ECOWAS, to the Islamic Organization for Education and Sciences and Culture, to the European Union, to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and to the International Criminal Court, informing them and asking them to take all pertinent measures for the protection of the endangered heritage of Mali. That is how UNESCO called on all to cooperate in the protection of these sites, which testify to the golden age of Timbuktu and to its history that is around 10 or so centuries old. Following the destruction of monuments in Timbuktu in June 2012, Madame Bokova expressed her disappointment and consternation. She said that information relating to the Sidi Mohammed, Sidi Mokhtar, and Alpha Mokhtar mausoleums destructions was disconcerting. She argued that such destructions could not be justified by any reason whatsoever. She then called on all the parties involved in the conflict to put an end to these terrible and irreversible acts and to show responsibility for the protection of the inestimable cultural heritage for the benefit of future generations. Following the Operation Serval and the liberation of Timbuktu, a report was forwarded to UNESCO on the state of the conservation of the property. This report was submitted by Mali in January 2013 based on information collected from resource persons who had remained in the area in spite of the conflict. The report provides an overview of the situation of the various monuments that were part of the protected heritage. The report outlines the destruction by armed groups of the Amadou Fulan and Babaje mausoleums, as well as of the sacred door of the Sidi Yaya Mosque. The report further describes the complete destruction of 9 of the 16 mausoleums between May and July of 2012. This report also deals with the destruction and the prejudice, the serious prejudice arising therefrom to the authenticity and integrity of these items that appear on the World Heritage List since 1988. Mr. President, so much may have been done for the conservation and preservation of Timbuktu, and it has been thanks to the intrinsic value of these monuments as well as their substantial quality, not only traditional but also spiritual. Mr. Judge, Your Honors, the Timbuktu is not only a mass of stones and tombs for the 333 saints and other mausoleums. It is indeed an incarnation of the grandeur of African civilization. Timbuktu is an incarnation of African Islamic intelligence. It represents scientific, philosophical, and spiritual research which unfolded in that city. The destruction of Timbuktu should not override its construction in the collective memory. Suffering has arisen from these broken beliefs, and this remains present on the minds of the people. An incomplete restoration will not remedy this situation. Therefore, Mr. President, Your Honors, Timbuktu is a city which the entire world knows as a mythical and mystical city, one of the very first African sites to have been entered on the World Heritage List. When the nomination of this area was ongoing, it is particularly the historical and intellectual as well as spiritual aspects that were highlighted. The 3 major mosques and the 16 mausoleums of the main saints were recognized as an entity of elements that participated essentially to the spread of Islam in Africa at a very significant time, which testifies to the golden age of this intellectual and spiritual capital of the last days of the Askia dynasty. Mr. President, Your Honors, the African continent has always sought to protect the listed cultural entities and has already meted out punishment for various breaches of this principle. The mausoleums in Timbuktu also are a great symbol of the identity of a people. When a symbol is attacked and destroyed and broken, this, Mr. President, is something that denies Timbuktu of its golden age and deprives it of its myth, and its victims deserve to be compensated. Timbuktu for Africa is like the Tour Eiffel for France and the pyramids in Egypt. All tourists tend to go there. The reconstruction of the mausoleums undertaken by UNESCO did not sufficiently remedy the prejudice suffered by the victims. For all the victims whom I represent, the reconstruction of the monuments did not reconnect them spiritually with the saints through this link that existed. Therefore, the reconstruction and safeguarding of the Malian cultural heritage did not repair the spirit of the people. During that reconstruction exercise, Madame Bokova again traveled to Timbuktu and paid homage to the local communities without whom that reconstruction would not have been possible. The general director particularly saluted the work of the masons in Timbuktu, whose know-how was most important in the reconstruction of some of the ransacked buildings and monuments. I quote the Director General when she said, "Your courage is a lesson in tolerance, dialogue, and peace, and an answer to all extremists." She said, "Your action to safeguard the essential elements of your history is proof that Mali is picking up herself and is coming together with renewed confidence." Yes, Mr. President, it is true that Mali is picking itself up. But unfortunately, and in spite of the efforts undertaken, these broken links are still in place and, according to the victims whom I represent, amount to an irreparable prejudice. The link between those who are alive and the saints is through the keys of the mausoleums which are handed over to their guardians, and that link is broken today. All the physical persons whom I today represent before you did indeed have a key, a symbolic key, which is the link between the living and the spirits. This key is a relay, a link between one generation which leads on to another, and all of that is linked to the existence of the mausoleums. Your Honors, we must understand that these keys represent a more or less palpable link between a physical person and the sacred monuments. A relationship with God may be represented symbolically by this key, the key whereby those who receive it have today become victims, so to speak, as they remain guardians of spiritual and ancestral values that have been handed down from generation to generation. That is why, Mr. President, the victims felt that the destruction of these mausoleums were an attack on the dead, and the victims felt that attacking the dead, Mr. Al-Mahdi and his group actually attacked the living. Mr. President, when the myth in a child's mind collapses, his entire universe collapses. And rebuilding confidence in such circumstances is extremely difficult. The victims whom I represent today all have the same saints in their belief systems and their worship systems, the same sanctified ancestors who today have been demystified. Mr. President, Your Honors, it is this sentiment that the victims whom I represent want to bring to your attention, to the attention of this chamber. The sentiment that things are irreparable, the sentiment of suffering that has brought them to shout and to cry rather than to pray. When a child sees his father stripped naked, his hero, his model, collapses in his mind. The child will no longer see his father as a supernatural hero, but as a fallible human being. The victims of Timbuktu ordinarily would admire their saints as a child would admire his father. But again, like a child, they were stood helpless as their myth was being destroyed. Mr. President, the purpose of this crime, namely the destruction of historical monuments, is a philosophical and revisionist purpose. It is a worst-case scenario and a politicization of the crime that was implemented by armed bandits. It is a well-planned crime. It was a well-planned crime which sought not only to destroy people's spirits and souls, but also to demystify their spirits. In general terms, the purpose was to attack a culture, to attack the heritage of the people, and to wipe out a people's soul and their roots, to wipe out their memory, and to clear all their bearings and values. The perpetrators of such a crime are not acting against a specific individual, but against an entire community. I would like to briefly quote Stephen Rapp, former chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and at the Special Tribunal for Sierra Leone, who is a specialist in war crimes. Mr. Stephen Rapp said the following: the destruction of religious, cultural, or historical objects, as well as heritage, is another way of destroying a civilization, of destroying a religion. Such things on which societies are built. These crimes have not yet been prosecuted. The demolition of holy places in Timbuktu by Mr. Al-Mahdi and his people is in fact not an accident, but rather a demonstration of a true will to destroy. According to Mr. Al-Mahdi and his group, they believed that these mausoleums are idols which are banished under the Sharia law. What they sought to do was to destroy items which they believed were heretical and forbidden according to a fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. Ansar Dine therefore sought to eradicate the past of the people of Timbuktu and its identity. The issue here was not just a matter of collateral damage arising from traditional warfare, but rather the annihilation of heritage as a weapon of war. Therefore, the victims in Timbuktu suffer morally in the same way as others suffer similarly across the world. That is why Timbuktu has become a reflection of common suffering, particularly in relation to its recognition as World Cultural Heritage. Mr. President, Your Honors, let me quote from Raphael Lemkin, who already in 1933 spoke about the necessity to include acts of vandalism in the various categories of the most serious international crimes. According to that lawyer, an attack against a collectivity can also be carried out through the destruction of various items which testify to its soul and to its genius or creativity. Mr. President, the purpose of this statement is that culture constitutes immensely to world cultural heritage and therefore is wealth for humanity in its totality. Therefore, when cultural heritage, art, and what have you are destroyed systematically, this must be considered to be an act of vandalism against world culture. The perpetrator of such a crime causes irreparable damage not only to the owner of the destroyed items, but also to the collectivity to which the item belongs, as well as to the entire humanity. Clearly, the criminal intent of the perpetrator of such a crime, according to this lawyer, Mr. Lemkin, was contrary to culture and to the progress of humanity. Since 1933, things have not changed. The jurisprudence of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia recognized war crimes for the destruction of cultural and historical heritage as a crime destroying memory and souls. The 2004 judgment is the relevant precedence whereby an accused found guilty of such a crime led the chamber to consider that the bombing of Dubrovnik, a town that appeared on the World Heritage List since 1974, amounted to an attack not only on the history and heritage of the area, but also on the cultural heritage of humanity. It is a crime. The chamber, in that case, further held that attacks against civilian buildings amount to serious violations of international humanitarian law, and more so when such attacks target specifically protected sites. Mr. President, this judgment shows that such crimes are irreparable crimes similar to the crime which your chamber must consider today. And such is not mitigated by a guilty plea, even if all parties agree thereto. Mr. Mahdi, through his crimes, Mr. Mahdi rather has in fact acknowledged guilt for his crime. Mindful of the evidence provided by the opposition, it was difficult for Mr. Mahdi to proceed otherwise. And today, he attempts to convince the court that by entering a guilty plea in unconditional and open circumstances, he has expressed his remorse for the acts that were committed. However, the true question that must be addressed, Mr. President, is the following. Is this guilty plea sincere? And does it flow from a genuine desire to repair the prejudice arising from the crimes? Let us not be misled. Words alone are not sufficient. In parentheses, the request for forgiveness could have been uttered at the pretrial level, but it was never uttered. We must bear in mind that the modus operandi of Ansar al-Din, as illustrated in its various propaganda videos that were displayed by the prosecutor, point to the deliberate nature and the well-planned and thought-out systems of the attack on the historic and religious monuments. Mr. Mahdi supported all of this and provided all possible assistance to these acts by participating himself in the destruction of the mausoleums and collaborating with others. Worse still, he used his knowledge and know-how not for the promotion of diversity and respect, but to sow seeds of ignorance and intolerance. He played a unique and central role in preparing by conducting research and expressing opinions that justified the atrocities and crimes committed. Mr. Mahdi was the key in this propaganda and in the actions of the armed groups. This support from Mr. Mahdi was essential in providing the wisdom that would guide these unacceptable acts when he supported the Ansar al-Din strategy and the media coverage that went with it. Your Honors, this case is one that deals with a crime against cultural heritage. So, there is no more proof that such a crime only contributes to obscure the minds of people. It is prejudice and damage that goes beyond the simple and dramatic destruction of material monuments to the destruction of the minds which therefore must be understood to be crimes that fall within the jurisdiction of this court. And it is for this reason that the victims question the sincerity of the guilty plea and the remorse expressed by the accused person. The victims do not accept Mr. Mahdi's confession. Some even argue that this guilty plea only serves to address matters of liability. I can talk about this because I am just returning from Timbuktu. The victims say that forgiveness has been asked for at the wrong place. Why is he doing it only here in the court? Why is that guilty plea being entered so late when the trial is already ongoing? Mr. President, for all these reasons, the victims appear respectfully before your court to ask for the conservation and protection of cultural heritage, and that any crimes in that regard should be severely punished. The issue, they say, is not only to reconstruct the heritage, but that a clear signal must be given to the world that such crimes cannot go unpunished. Your Honors, the exemplary sanction that you will provide will usher in a new era for the protection of protected sites. The time has come for severe sanctions to be meted out against those who contribute to such destruction. In Mali, in Afghanistan, in Syria, and in Iraq, such must be the case. This trial must be historical to the extent that it upholds the fight against impunity and the fight against the destruction of mankind's common heritage. The victims whom I represent consider this to be a historic crime. A historic crime, one of the most serious crimes, which is the reason for which a permanent international criminal court was created. The destruction of sacred and historical monuments is something that must be punished severely. They expect that your judgment will be an exemplary sanction, both for the past and for the future. Mr. President, Your Honors, the victims whom I represent, thank your chamber for the time that you granted them, and I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kassongo. Judge Mindua would like to ask you some questions. Mr. Kassongo.
Oui, Maître.
Judge Mindua, counsel, I have two questions for you. My first question is this. Exactly which victims do you represent? The ones who filled out the victims' forms, or are you representing the entire community? Answer, thank you, Your Honor. I represent the victims who were authorized by this chamber to take part in these proceedings. Question, perfect, very well, thank you. Now, my second question. I'd like us to return to the issue of harm done to these victims. Of course, now you said that Timbuktu is not just a city made up of stone. By destroying the mausoleums, the attackers did not just tear down stone buildings, they did harm to the people of Timbuktu and to the entire international community. Thus, irreparable harm was done to the local inhabitants and to all of humanity. But I'd like us to go back to the mausoleums themselves. In Romano-Germanic law, which you have studied, reparations for material harm is governed by the principle of integral reparations of harm done. And thus compensation must cover the loss suffered by the victim and lucrum quiescence, what has been lost. Now the families that were the guardians or custodians of the mausoleums, should they receive... You mentioned income derived from tourism, and I am still somewhat at a loss. Did the families receive any sort of income derived from tourism? Thank you. Answer. Thank you very much, Your Honor. If I could specify one particular point. I am speaking on behalf of the victims, and I asked, and this was not an easy endeavor. Law can be very technical in nature, and since we have a mixture of various legal systems here at the court, it is not necessarily easy for the victims in the field to understand all of the legal issues at stake. To my mind, I had to strike the right balance between the loss of income, and I did not spend a great deal of time on that particular issue because I wanted to avoid inaudible. The Western concept of income is one thing, but there is a local meaning as well. Beside the mausoleums, you see, people lived their lives, conducted their businesses, and when tourists would visit, Your Honor, the people who were in the area, who were adjacent to the mausoleum, would earn or gain some meager income, very meager, small amounts. But I would not say that this money was income in a Western sense or in a technical sense. But obviously, without the mausoleums, these earnings have dropped. And what is more, there are fewer and fewer tourists coming to the city. Also the fact that the city is perceived as a less safe place. So less tourism. We can speak of income, but perhaps we should speak of the money that can be earned by way of any sort of transaction relating to tourism. Up until now, these people who have responsibility for the mausoleums do derive a little bit of money, very, very meager amounts. But because tourists are few and far between, these people are only earning a few cents here and there. So I really don't think we can talk about the loss of a certain level of income. I think your chamber will have to make the appropriate determination. But the meaning that we attach to the words material harm or prejudice in our legal systems must be adjusted to take into account the local realities. I mean, tourists do not necessarily bring in a lot of money. I can only speak to a general in a general sense to what the people have lost.